The heavy oak doors creaked open as if aware of the weight of history about to unfold, and every eye inside the courtroom turned as Ellen DeGeneres entered the chamber, with the kind of composure that only years under public scrutiny could forge. Yet, even through her poised demeanor, attention clung to her like smoke trailing behind an explosion. Reporters leaned forward, pens at the ready. Courtroom sketch artists froze in mid-line, the jury straightened in their seats, and even Judge Riley seemed to tighten his grip on the gavel. She walked slowly. Her heels muted against the carpeted aisle, hands folded at her front. As the bailiff called the court to order, the air thickened with anticipation, and when the judge gave a single firm knock, the silence that followed rang louder than thunder. Ellen stepped onto the witness stand, her expression unreadable as she took the oath. "I do," she said, voice clear and even, and then she sat down, adjusted the lapel of her navy suit, and met the prosecutor's eyes. Squarely, the man standing across from her was Assistant District Attorney Marcus Hayes, known in legal circles for being deliberate, composed, and quietly ruthless. He gave a nod and began softly, respectful but direct. "Ms. DeGeneres, you've known Mr. Diddy in both professional and personal contexts, correct?" She responded with a nod. "Yes, I've collaborated with him on several projects over the years, and I also considered him a friend." Marcus continued, "On the night of July 14th, you were invited to Mr. Diddy Combs' estate in Holmby Hills. Under what premise?" Ellen drew a breath and let it out slowly. "I was told it was for a creative meeting about a charity telethon, an idea that had been floating around between our teams for months. I didn't expect anything unusual. I thought it was just planning logistics and pitching some ideas. But that night it changed slowly." "Not suddenly," she added, eyes darkening slightly. "When I arrived, it was just past midnight. I took a side entrance as requested to avoid paparazzi. Inside, everything felt normal at first, familiar, even the chandelier lights, the echo of laughter down the corridor, the smell of expensive cigars and aged leather from the library. Diddy met me at the foyer. He seemed warm, but a little distracted. I chalked it up to being busy with his schedule." Marcus leaned forward. "What happened next?" Ellen pressed her hands together more tightly. "We began discussing segments for the telethon. But then he brought out a sealed envelope, handed it to me, and asked for my honest opinion. I remember that very clearly. It was in the library door, shut behind us." The tone shifted. She paused just briefly. Inside were internal documents, emails, and a typed memo. It listed names of potential contacts, people I recognized from the media and legal worlds. There was a section labeled "Leverage Points." Marcus asked, "And what was your reaction?" Ellen's jaw tightened. I was confused and honestly concerned. I asked him directly if this was normal for PR strategy. He hesitated, then said it was a last resort to protect his legacy. When I told him, it felt like more than that, like he was planning to manipulate people. He looked me in the eyes and asked me to trust him and to keep everything between us. "Did you agree?" Ellen shook her head. I told him I was uncomfortable and that I didn't want to be involved in anything unethical. He told me it was just exploratory, and nothing would come of it unless absolutely necessary. Marcus held up a printed document. "Ellen, do you recognize this?" She nodded. "That's the draft email I wrote to my assistant later that night, saved it as a draft. First, because I didn't want to draw attention." Marcus read aloud. "Something feels off. This isn't just charity work. Keep this between us for now," and then handed it to the judge for review. The jury scribbled frantically. Ellen continued. I didn't send it until morning. I wanted to sleep on it, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen the memo, the tone, the way his demeanor shifted as if I'd crossed a line just by asking questions. The prosecutor walked back toward his desk, then returned holding another document. Did you ever follow up with Mr. Diddy after that? She nodded. I called his assistant at 4:02 a.m. and asked if everything was okay. They replied curtly, "Everything's under control. No need to worry." That response made my stomach drop. I knew this wasn't just an idea being floated, it felt like cleanup. Marcus paused, then tapped on the screen of a court-provided tablet. "Miss DeGeneres, were you aware that at 3:22 a.m., just before your email was sent, a server log from Mr. Diddy's device showed an unauthorized deletion?" Ellen's brow furrowed. "I wasn't aware of the exact time, but I did fear the documents might disappear. That's why I emailed a copy to my lawyer." Marcus turned to the jury, a copy that arrived at 3:35 a.m. Just 13 minutes after the deletion, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ellen's hands trembled slightly, but her voice held firm. "I didn't want to believe what I suspected, but I knew I couldn't sit on that kind of information." Marcus nodded, then played a brief recording from the mansion's library camera. The footage showed Ellen holding the memo mid-discussion with Diddy. The room gasped collectively. The image crystal clear. The judge tapped his pen twice. "Court will recess in 5 minutes. Please remain seated." Marcus moved quickly. "Miss DeGeneres, after you sent the email, did you receive any direct communication from Mr. Diddy?" Ellen looked down briefly, then back up. "Yes, he called me himself. About 40 minutes later, he sounded different, nervous. Almost asked if I still had the memo on my phone when I said it was already with my attorney. He went silent for a second, then said, 'Ellen, please delete that draft. For our sake, wipe it clean.'" The gallery froze. Marcus let the moment hang, then asked, "And how did you respond?" Ellen's eyes were sharp now. "I told him no. I said it would be wrong to erase anything." He paused, then said, "Okay, but remember, this stays between us." She finished in a whisper. It didn't feel like a request. It felt like a warning. The judge leaned forward, pen poised over his notes, and the prosecutor returned to his seat, signaling no further questions as the judge nodded toward the defense attorney. The gallery whispered low, like wind before a storm. But Ellen DeGeneres sat still on the stand, the weight of her decision settling in her bones. This was no longer about celebrity or creative partnerships. This was about the truth laid bare in front of strangers who would decide its worth. The courtroom doors remained closed, but the world beyond was already listening. And by the time Judge Riley dismissed the court for recess, it was clear that this trial would not only test the character of one man, but the courage of those who dared speak against him, and Ellen had just become the first domino to fall in what many would later call the most consequential day of the Diddy trial. As the courtroom settled back into its rhythm, following the short recess, the tension that hung in the air refused to dissolve. It clung to every surface like humidity, thick and relentless. Ellen DeGeneres had resumed her seat in the witness box, her presence still commanding even as her posture suggested fatigue. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the continuation of proceedings, and Assistant District Attorney Marcus Hayes stood once more, his voice calm but deliberate. "Ms. DeGeneres, I'd like to revisit the timeline with you," he began, focusing on the moments immediately following your departure from the Diddy estate. Ellen nodded slowly. "I left around 2 to 10 a. I'm feeling deeply unsettled. I didn't go home." I sat in my car for almost half an hour just thinking, processing what I'd seen and heard. I didn't want to overreact, but my instincts were screaming. Something isn't right. Marcus leaned forward. When did you first act on those instincts? Ellen drew a slow breath. I pulled out my phone and opened the email app. I'd typed the message earlier, but hadn't sent it. I reread it twice, then hit send to my attorney's secured inbox. That was 3:35 a. He held up the printed email and pointed to the timestamp. Can you confirm this? Ellen nodded. Yes, that's correct. Marcus turned to the court ladies and gentlemen of the jury. The timestamp on this email matches exactly 13 minutes after the server logs show an unauthorized deletion on Mr. Comey's system. Ellen's actions were not only timely, but prescient. The defense attorney rose, objecting mildly. Your Honor, we have no evidence that Mr. Comey himself initiated that deletion. The judge waved him off for the moment. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Hayes. Marcus returned to Ellen. Did you speak with anyone else after sending the email? Ellen hesitated. Yes. I messaged a close friend, not about the details, but just to say something felt off. I didn't want to say too much in writing, and I was still hoping it wasn't what it seemed to be, but I had a feeling something was about to happen. Marcus nodded, then walked over to the evidence card and retrieved a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a sleek black smartphone, the label clearly identifying it as belonging to the defendant, Ms. DeGeneres. Are you familiar with this device? Ellen looked at it and gave a solemn nod. Yes. I've seen him use that exact phone during our meetings and at events. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, this device was obtained via subpoena and analyzed by our forensic team, with your permission. I'd like to play a series of voice memos retrieved from it. The judge gave a curt nod. The jury leaned in the first. Audio crackled slightly before revealing Ellen's voice, unmistakable, recorded without her knowledge. Sean, this feels like more than PR talk. This sounds like something else entirely. The courtroom gasped at the sound of her words echoing across the chamber. Then came Diddy Combs' voice, low and calculated. Trust me, Ellen, you'll see soon enough. That's all, he said. But the implication was suffocating. The judge called for order as murmurs swelled in the gallery. Marcus waited until the room quieted, then turned back to Ellen. Did you consent to this recording? Ellen's face tightened. No. I had no idea I was being recorded. Did you ever approve of your conversations being taped? No. Never. Marcus nodded and looked back to the jury. This is important, not only because of what was said, but because of how it was preserved. Mr. Comey was not just having a conversation. He was documenting a leverage play. He knew the risk and chose to record it. The defense stood again. Objection, Your Honor. This constitutes speculative interpretation of private conversation. The judge nodded, sustained in part. The jury will consider the tone and content, but will not presume motive unless further corroborated. Marcus smoothly shifted gears. Ms. DeGeneres, what was your immediate reaction when you discovered you had been recorded? Ellen's gaze sharpened. I felt betrayed. I felt like I was being boxed into something I didn't understand. I've been in show business for decades, and I've never been blindsided like that. Marcus turned again to the screen. Now I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit 37. A digital server log provided by our forensic analysts. It displays a 3:22 a.m. deletion of files directly associated with the internal memo reviewed by Ms. DeGeneres. He pointed at the screen. "See this line here? That is an administrator action logged under Mr. Combs's user ID." A hush fell over the room. The defense attorney stood quickly. Objection, that could be a spoofed login. "Your Honor, no direct evidence that Mr. Combs typed that command." The judge tapped his pen. "The court acknowledges that multiple users may have access to systems. The jury will consider the plausibility." Marcus returned to Ellen after this deletion. "Did you attempt to retrieve the document?" Ellen nodded. "I had already saved a copy locally, and on my attorney's drive I felt I had to protect it because I no longer trusted the system it came from." Marcus then asked, "And did you ever confront Mr. Combs directly?" Ellen straightened. "I called him at 4:45 a.m. He didn't pick up. I left a message saying I was confused and deeply uncomfortable. A few minutes later, his assistant called back, assuring me it was all a misunderstanding. That's when I knew for certain something was being covered up." The prosecutor took a step back and let his voice carry members of the jury. "We are building a pattern, a progression of events that point not to carelessness, but to calculated control from the sealed envelopes to the recording devices to the perfectly timed deletion. This isn't coincidence. This is choreography." The defense attorney rose again, trying to claw back control. "Ms. DeGeneres, let's return to motive. You have publicly supported Mr. Combs's charitable foundations, correct?" Ellen nodded. "Yes, I have, and those statements still stand. The causes were and are important to me." He held up a printout of one such statement. "Just last month you tweeted, 'Diddy Comb is a king of giving back to the community.' Would you say you admired him?" Ellen replied carefully, "I admired parts of him. But admiration doesn't mean blindness when things cross into unethical or illegal territory. It doesn't matter how much good someone's done. You have to speak up." The courtroom rustled with the weight of her words. Marcus took that moment to approach the clerk presenting a flash drive. "Your Honor, this contains an internal memo obtained through discovery marked confidential and consistent with the document. Ms. DeGeneres described the judge, accepted it. The clerk placed it into the record and the projector flickered to life, displaying the memo's first page, key names highlighted, and a section titled Influence and Proximity." Ellen pointed quietly. "Those are the same names I saw, the same formatting, the same structure." Marcus nodded, then approached one final time. "One more question, Miss DeGeneres. When you realized what this memo truly represented, what was your first thought?" Ellen didn't blink. "I thought this could bury people, not just reputations, not just careers, but the truth. And if I didn't speak, someone else would suffer." The courtroom absorbed her answer like a sponge. The silence afterward was not empty, but dense, layered with consequence. Marcus turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded slowly and looked toward the defense. "You may cross-examine, Mr. Grant." The defense attorney approached, but even as he straightened his tie and adjusted his cuffs, it was clear the balance of power had shifted. Ellen sat still, her calm a thunderous contrast to the storm beginning to rise on the defense bench, and as Mr. Grant opened his mouth to speak, the entire courtroom leaned forward, knowing the next words might decide whether Diddy Combs' empire would crumble or endure. The courtroom was still yet pulsing with unspoken tension as defense attorney Jonathan Grant adjusted his stance near the witness box, his fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the podium. His eyes settled on Ellen DeGeneres, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, even warm. "Ms. DeGeneres, thank you for your detailed testimony," he began. You mentioned that you've worked with Mr. Diddycombe for many years on creative projects. Can you recall a time when those collaborations involved intense negotiations? Ellen nodded of course. Working in entertainment often means navigating different visions and personalities. Jonathan offered a brief smile. Exactly, and disagreements happen, correct? Creative friction, Ellen replied without hesitation. Yes, but I never equated friction with secrecy. Jonathan continued, pressing gently, and yet you're telling this court that on the night of July 14th, you not only suspected wrongdoing but believed your presence at the meeting placed you at risk. Ellen's voice didn't waver. That's correct. It wasn't the kind of tension that comes from arguing over a segment order. It felt strategic, controlled, like I was being enlisted in something quietly dangerous. Jonathan paced slowly before the jury, pausing for effect. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's not confuse discomfort with illegality. He turned back to Ellen. Miss DeGeneres, would it be fair to say your judgment that evening was affected by surprise or even fatigue? Ellen raised an eyebrow. I've hosted the Oscars 3 times back-to-back. Fatigue doesn't make me forget what I read in black and white. Jonathan nodded, then held up a printed screenshot of Ellen's own tweet praising Diddycombe from weeks prior. In this post, you refer to him as a visionary with integrity. Would you like to amend that statement? Ellen blinked once. No, that's how I felt at the time. My view changed when I saw evidence that contradicted the person I thought I knew. Jonathan walked toward the clerk and retrieved a printout of her email draft, the one sent at 3:35 a.m., then turned to the screen displaying a side-by-side with the server log deletion at 3:22 a. He pointed out that both timestamps were close, but not conclusive. Do you have any proof, Ms. DeGeneres, that the deletion was done by Mr. Diddycombe himself? Ellen stared at him directly. No, I do not, but I do know that the timing was not coincidence. Jonathan stepped closer then. What you're offering is an assumption, Ellen replied evenly. I'm offering the truth as I experienced it. The jury will decide what that means. Jonathan nodded again, then tapped the screen to show the metadata of the email and memo. You have technical training. Ms. DeGeneres, are you qualified to interpret server logs? Ellen's face remained composed. I'm not a tech expert, but I don't need a PhD to know when someone is trying to cover their tracks. Jonathan paused, then said quietly, Have you ever been accused of holding grudges professionally? Ellen's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm sure I've had my moments, but this is not about a grudge. This is about integrity. Jonathan held up his tablet now. Let's talk about the recording. You say you were unaware you were being recorded. Ellen nodded. That's correct. Jonathan turned to the judge. Your Honor, this brings us to a crucial legal point. The recording was obtained without consent in a private setting and must therefore be excluded. The judge tapped his pen. Defense makes a fair argument, however. The prosecution asserts this recording shows intent, which is a valid exception in criminal proceedings. The jury will be instructed to weigh its relevance accordingly. Jonathan exhaled, slowly returning to Ellen. This recording captures your voice, stating that what you were hearing felt manipulative. Is it possible your interpretation was colored by personal bias? Ellen replied, I've known the difference between manipulation and persuasion for decades. That night I heard a man trying to use me, not collaborate with me. Jonathan then raised his final card. Did you speak to anyone in the media prior to this subpoena? Ellen's eyes narrowed, and I resented the implication I brought this. Forward, because I had to, not because I wanted a headline, Jonathan nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge nodded, and the prosecutor rose once more. Mr. Hayes stepped forward with renewed clarity, his expression taut. Miss DeGeneres, one final point of clarification. You stated earlier that Mr. Diddy contacted you directly after the email was sent. Ellen nodded yes. Hayes continued. And in that call, did he make any request related to the memo or the email? Ellen's jaw tightened. He asked me to delete the draft, he said, and I quote, wipe it clean for our sake. Hayes turned to the jury. There you have it. Not inferred, not assumed, spoken directly. A request to destroy evidence. The room reacted in a wave of sharp breaths. The judge struck his gavel to settle the gallery. Hayes continued. Miss DeGeneres, did you comply with that request? Ellen's response came swiftly. I told him that would be wrong, he then said. Trust me. Nobody needs to see that. That's when I knew I had to go to the authorities. Hayes took one final step toward the jury. This is not conjecture. This is testimony directly supported by time-stamped communication server logs and a voice memo captured not by the witness, but by the defendant himself. Judge Riley leaned forward, eyes scanning the jury, then turned to Ellen. Ms. DeGeneres, you may step down. Thank you for your testimony. Ellen nodded, stood slowly, and walked down the aisle, her expression solemn but resolute. As she returned to her seat, the room tracked her every movement, and when she sat down, she exhaled a single breath as though releasing the entire weight of the last 24 hours. The judge cleared his throat. The prosecution may call its next witness. Marcus Hayes stood. The prosecution calls Marisol Vega, in-house counsel for Comby's Entertainment. The bailiff escorted Miss Vega to the witness stand, a tall, composed woman with clipped speech and a leather-bound notebook. She raised her right hand, took the oath, and sat with practiced ease. Mr. Hayes approached Ms. Vega. On July 15th, you were handed a memo by Mr. Diddy, correct? Yes, marked high priority. It was brought to my attention by internal staff and reviewed that morning. Can you describe its contents? A list of names and possible communications with individuals affiliated with the investigation. I viewed it as preparatory for reputational management. Nothing more. Hayes leaned in. Did you view any part of the memo as improper? Marisol replied. I did not see language that rose to the level of illegality. However, I advised caution. I recommended that any outreach be formal, documented, and limited to legal counsel. Did Mr. Diddy follow that advice? Marisol hesitated. I'm not aware of any off-record contact, but I cannot rule it out. Hayes stepped closer, so you can't confirm whether or not the outreach occurred. Marisol answered honestly. I was not involved in private communications. Hayes nodded and turned to the judge. No further questions. The defense attorney approached swiftly. Ms. Vega, is it standard for internal counsel to review documents and advise, but not investigate all channels of communication? Yes, she replied. Our scope is limited unless discovery is ordered. And did you at any point feel that the memo constituted criminal conduct? No. It was vague and open to interpretation. The judge asked Ms. Vega. You may step down. Thank you. Marisol left the stand, her expression unreadable, and returned to the gallery where she opened her notebook and began taking notes. Once more, the judge looked down at the docket, then up at the prosecution. We will reconvene in 30 minutes for rebuttal. The court is in recess, and as the gavel struck, the courtroom buzzed again with a current too thick to ignore. Because somewhere between the contradiction of two witnesses, one thing had become painfully clear. This was no longer a case about legality alone. It was a test of trust, of perception, of what power does when unchallenged, and now, with two voices echoing from opposite ends of the empire, the jury would have to decide which one would shape the verdict that was still to come. The courtroom doors reopened with a low groan that seemed to match the collective weight in the room, and as the jury filed back into their seats, their faces bore the marks of contemplation, the kind that comes only from sifting through evidence laced with fame, shadowed by power, and scorched by the gravity of truth. Ellen DeGeneres sat upright, though her posture had softened her gaze, still locked forward as if bracing for one final storm. Judge Riley had returned to his bench, gave a single nod, and the clerk resumed her place. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Hayes rose for closing arguments. His tone measured almost reverent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began. "We've spent the past 21 days navigating testimony documents, voice recordings, server logs, and conflicting statements, but if there is one thread that ties them all together, it is this. Mr. Diddy acted not in ignorance or accident, but with intention." He gestured toward the evidence table. "We have a confidential memo marked leverage, reviewed in private with a former collaborator. We have a witness who risked public scrutiny to share what she saw, and we have forensic proof that that same document was deleted 13 minutes before it reached her attorney." He paused, eyes sweeping the jury. "Now, some will argue that these are pieces, not a whole, but patterns do not need to shout. They whisper, and when those whispers align, they become a confession." Marcus walked slowly now, stopping before the projection screen, consider the voice recording. Ellen didn't know she was being taped, and yet we hear her alarm, hear his response, "Trust me, Ellen, you'll see soon enough." This wasn't reassurance. It was quiet coercion, and finally his direct request, "Wipe it clean for our sake. No ambiguity, no middle ground. That is obstruction, that is intent." Marcus turned away from the screen. "Let me remind you, this trial isn't about punishing ego. It's about protecting integrity. Because if we excuse powerful men who delete evidence, pressure colleagues, and manipulate optics, then the law bends and never straightens again. I ask you to deliver a verdict that reflects not just the facts, but the weight of what they represent." He returned to his seat with quiet finality. The room held its breath. The defense rose slowly. Jonathan Grant now stood before the jury with a legal pad in hand and the calm air of someone attempting to pull back a curtain clouded by outraged members of the jury. He began. "We've witnessed drama. We've heard compelling testimony, but at the end of the day, your job is not to judge character. Your duty is to apply the law." He tapped the pad in my hand. "I hold every piece of evidence admitted, and not one of them proves beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Diddy orchestrated a criminal act. We have emails, yes, but we do not have a signed directive. We have a recording, yes, but we do not have a full context. We have a witness with credibility, yes, but also with emotional conflict who admitted herself to being blindsided by her discovery." Jonathan walked toward the center aisle. The memo could be interpreted as PR strategy. Marisol Vega testified that it didn't exceed legal thresholds. The deletion of files could be IT protocol, the timing suspicious, perhaps, but suspicion is not proof. And as for the voice memo, Mr. Diddy never says delete the evidence. He says, "Trust me, Now, if we live in a world where trust becomes crime, where privacy becomes motive, then none of us are safe." He turned to Ellen, seated calmly, her hands folded and back to the jury. Would a man planning to silence a witness really invite a woman with her platform to read the memo he's allegedly trying to bury? Or was he simply venting, seeking guidance from someone he considered a friend? He paused, then delivered his final line. "If you're not sure if a piece is missing from the puzzle, then the picture isn't complete. Find him not guilty." He sat, and the courtroom fell into a silence that bordered on sacred. Judge Riley stood and turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you will now deliberate in private. Consider only the facts presented and render your verdict accordingly." The bailiff led the jurors out one by one, their expressions unreadable, and the courtroom settled into a tension so thick even the air itself seemed reluctant to move. Outside, cameras clicked through glass windows. Satellite vans hummed across the street, and in the hallway, pundits prepared their first post-verdict scripts. Inside, Ellen remained still, her thoughts racing though her face betrayed nothing across the aisle. Diddy sat upright, his gaze hard, his jaw clenched, the showman in him utterly silent. And then an hour passed. 2. The courtroom remained suspended in time. When the jury returned, their eyes were focused, their papers in hand, and the world outside seemed to lean in collectively, holding its breath. Judge Riley asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged man with steel-gray hair and a creased brow, nodded, "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The judge gestured, "Please read it aloud." The foreman cleared his throat in the matter of the state of California versus Shaw Diddy on the charge of obstruction of justice. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A single word, and yet it crashed through the courtroom like thunder. Gasps erupted from the gallery, reporters bolted upright. Ellen's eyes closed for a moment. Just one heartbeat of release before opening again with solemn clarity. Diddy didn't flinch. Not immediately, but his shoulders slackened, the weight of consequence folding into his spine. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them with praise for their service, and then turned to the defense. "Sentencing will be scheduled within the week. Pending pre-sentencing reports, court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and with that, the courtroom dissolved into motion. Ellen stood slowly, as if trying not to disturb the echo still lingering in the room. Diddy remained seated, staring forward, unmoving for a moment longer before finally rising to be escorted out by federal officers. No cuffs yet, just procedure, but the image of him walking through the courtroom doors with cameras waiting on the other side would become iconic. A billionaire titan fallen not to violence or scandal, but to silence, to strategy, to the quiet testimony of someone who refused to look away. Ellen made her way through the corridor, eyes shielded by dark glasses, her voice low as she spoke briefly to reporters. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came here because I still believe the truth matters," she said before disappearing into a waiting vehicle behind her. The building loomed not just as a courthouse, but as the place where power met its match in principle, and the trial of Shaw Diddy would ripple far beyond its walls, across industries, across circles of influence, and across every whisper that once believed some people were simply untouchable. In the days that followed, Ellen would return to her show, albeit changed, quieter, stronger. Diddy team would file appeals, deny wrongdoing, and regroup behind doors no longer soundproof, and in the archive rooms of legal offices, voice memos and server logs would remain as digital echoes of a story that reminded the world. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It unfolds slowly, deliberately, and inevitably, one sentence at a time.